So our panelists, starting with, as the cliche goes, a man who really needs no introduction, but is absolutely true in this case, George Takei, who's Chairman Emeritus and member of the board at the Japanese American National Museum. Wayne Merrill Collins, I saw him a moment ago. Wayne is also a lawyer and has carried on his father's work defending Iva Toguri after his father's death in 1974, which eventually led to her landmark pardon in 1977, and has been a keeper of his father's legacy. And Sharon Yamato, our director. Sharon's a good friend, a writer, a Rafushimpo columnist, done many things for the museum, but over the past decade or so has really built quite a body of work of films that discuss kind of little known elements of the Japanese American incarceration experience. And I think they're all available for sale, so please check out her other films, although I think this is her best work yet. So, but anyway, I just wanted to start maybe with Sharon and the question of what brought you, you talked about it a little at the beginning, but really what brought you to this story, to make a film about this story, maybe backing up and even how you first learned about Wayne Collins.
Okay, I want to,
I
have to turn it on. That would be good.
There we go. First of all, I want to say that maybe this is where I'm supposed to say that of all the historians that we interviewed in the film, Brian Niiya was the best, right? and to all my running friends out there, I know there's a lot of you in the audience, he's also a fairly decent runner. But, oh gosh, I forgot the question. Oh yes, what drove me to make a film about Wayne Collins? Okay, I'm sitting next to the person who really inspired this work because I heard him speak at the 2014 Tule Lake pilgrimage, and I had no idea that the work that his father did, the intense work that his father did, and the conflicts that he faced in terms of having to deal with this other entity, the Southern California branch of the ACLU, and the JCL, and the National ACLU. But Wayne described it so brilliantly and in such detail that I thought that it was a story that really needed to be told. And of course, Tule Lake is a camp that not very many people know about, and it's really a shame because most people who know about it think of it in terms of it being very, like, it was a shameful place for so many people for so many years. So I think it was important for me to bring it to light, to talk about some of the conflicts that went on there. So I think we are just beginning to touch the surface of that, and I really think that it's an important story to tell.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to ask George, how you first learned about Wayne Collins.
Well, I never met Wayne Collins until I went to the pilgrimage that Sharon talks about, and the Wayne Collins I met was his son. And that's the first time I met Wayne Collins. And yet, I feel a deep, profound, personal connection with his father, Wayne Collins, because my life is what it is today because of him. Had he not stepped in, my mother was renounced her citizenship because of the unrelenting series of outrages perpetrated on her and our family. And they first, while we were in Tule Lake, Congress passed a law allowing for the renunciation of American citizens, born Americans, in the middle of a wartime. It was an unconstitutional act on the part of Congress. And the Hoshidan, the radicalized rebels in Tule Lake, and they were radicalized not by Japan, they were radicalized by the United States government, because a number of them, right after Pearl Harbor, had rushed to the recruitment centers to volunteer to serve in the U.S. military. This act of patriotism was answered with a slap on the face. They were denied military service, categorized as enemy alien, which was preposterous, and imprisoned. And then once we were imprisoned, the government realized there was a wartime manpower shortage. And here are all these young men and women that they could have had, but they were categorized as enemy alien. So how do you justify drafting enemy aliens out of an internment camp, already imprisoned? So they came down with a completely incompetently put together loyalty questionnaire, which was referred to in the film. And it was so outrageous. For example, question 27 asked everyone over the age of 17 to whatever age. You could have been an 88-year-old immigrant lady. They were asked, are you willing to bear arms? Are you willing to serve in the United States military and bear arms to defend the United States? My parents had 3 very young children. I was 6 by then. My baby sister was a toddler. And they were being asked to abandon their children with no other provisions for them and bear arms to defend the nation that's imprisoning their children. They gave an honest, truthful answer. No. The person asking that question were the outrageous one. My parents behaved as any good parents do. Question 28 was even more outrageous. It was one sentence with 2 conflicting ideas. It asked, will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? We're Americans. We never even thought of a loyalty to the emperor, much less profess a loyalty to him. And the word forswear suggests that we have an inborn racial loyalty to the emperor because of his face. Again, they answered honestly, no. Because they didn't have that loyalty. But then that carried over to the first part of the same sentence, will you swear your loyalty to the United States, was incriminating. There were so many people, thousands of Japanese Americans who wanted to do anything to get out of camp, and if it meant answering yes to that they would, and they did. But they incriminated themselves because that yes carried over to the second part of that same sentence, meant that they were confessing that they had been loyal to the emperor. And so because of those outrageous questions, they answered no, considered no-nos by other internees, and the government categorized them as disloyal and put into Tule Lake. After all that, the young people joined the Hoshidan, radicalized by the cruel and stupid treatment of them by the government, and they became activists to support the emperor. They announced that they would rise up when the Japanese army lands on the soil of the continental United States, and they would join with them. And these radicals wanted to increase their numbers, but most people in Tule Lake did not. And so and because the law that allowed citizens to renounce their citizenship didn't work with them, they decided they're going to put additional pressure on them, and they said they're going to close Tule Lake and throw everybody out in the middle of the war. And there was no end to the cruelty of the Congress. And that was what put terror in most people's minds, because we're still at war. The hostility to Japanese Americans was fierce, was intense. Rednecks were taking pot shots at white people coming to visit their friends in camp. And so my mother, in order to protect the family, renounced her citizenship. And that was what got her into trouble. Had it not been for Wayne Collins stepping in, my mother had a place on a ship sailing for Japan on November 15th, 1945, to go to a war-torn country. I would have, well, the whole family would have gone with my mother. I would have grown up in a war-torn country, speaking Japanese, and struggling to survive. Wayne Collins saved me from that fate. Had it not been for Wayne Collins, I probably would not be speaking English as I do. I probably would be a totally different person. And so I owe so much to this extraordinary American, principled American, and courageous American, who took on the case of all Japanese Americans. Particularly his taking on the case of all those who challenged the internment, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in this, during the war, in 1944, Roosevelt's racism had infected even the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against Wayne Collins and Japanese Americans. So we Japanese Americans, as a community, the descendants of those that were incarcerated and the descendants of those who were intimidated into browbeaten and bullied into renouncing their citizenship, a great deal of debt to this amazing, courageous, principled man who passionately loved the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you, George, for that. You know, there's so many stories like that you hear over the years, and I want to ask Wayne, well, first, just what it felt like just to hear your father's voice again, and it's a very, what I loved about it is you really got a sense of his personality and, you know, his language from the tape.
Well, it was sort of terrifying. So I experienced him differently than his clients. But apart from that fact, I loved him greatly. I admired him tremendously. I thought he was the greatest lawyer that America ever produced, and I still think so to this day. I disagree with some of the comments about his ability or the tenor of the briefs that he wrote. I read them all. And every case that he took on appeal, whether they be on behalf of Jehovah's Witnesses, on behalf of socialists who wanted to speak in a public school building, on behalf of many people over the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, And I thought them quite good. His language was very direct. But remember that at that time, you wouldn't see a brief written as they're written now. 1940, there wasn't that much case law. There weren't that many articles written about constitutional law. There was Ex parte Milligan, a Civil War era case that came up after Lincoln was president, and very few others that interpreted the Constitution and the War Powers Act. And what oddly enough struck me, and I'm really digressing now, is that somewhere at home I found a copy of the Korematsu brief, and inside the flyleaf is a letter from A.J. Zerpeli, the prosecutor in that case, and later a federal judge, telling him what a great job it was. In fact, when Zerpeli's parents got in trouble, he hired my father, because they had a nationality problem being Italian immigrants. So history is very complex, and recollections of history differ from person to person. And so it's hard to find out where the truth lies. Where the truth lies in regard to the entire internment program is that the truth lies with the liar, and that is the United States government. As early as 1938-36, Harold Ickes, in his correspondence, wrote that he was concerned. They were concerned about Japan. They've been concerned about Japan since 1933. At Roosevelt's first cabinet meeting, it's recorded in Jim Farley's memoirs, Farley being his campaign manager, a Democratic Party Postmaster General, Democratic Party of New York chairman, writes, well, the first question that Roosevelt asked was, what about Japan? It was on their minds from the very beginning. They knew that a war was going to occur. What were they going to do about it? Ickes noted that they were concerned during the late 30s about the rights of Japanese Americans who were being assaulted by Chinese Americans or Filipino Americans because of what was going on in public knowledge with the war in the Pacific and the war in Asia already. And so you had a minority within an Asian minority that required a lot of careful attention for its own defense. For its own defense. And by a government which knew that there was not one single corroborated evidentiary fact of sabotage or disloyalty by the Japanese Americans in this country, but went ahead and allowed the internment program to take place. That government, once it set this fiendish machine in operation, was stuck with the consequences, because once you create the bureaucracy, you create a new minority, you recreate attitudes toward them, and it went on in its own rollers and own engine for the next 20 years, when it shouldn't have, couldn't have, and was unconstitutional and thoroughly motivated by racial considerations. And it went on to Attorney General after Attorney General. How do you account for that? I can't account for it. The inertia of the American government, the failure of a system to work, the failure of politicians to come forward and to oppose it. I spent the last 2 days reading Gunnar Myrdal, American Dilemma, History of Race Relations in America. Myrdal writes, you know, there's a thing called the American Creed, that you believe in individual dignity, the rights of man, democracy, the right to live your own life, to be creative in your own way, and to be free from government interference. And every American believes it. You can ask them, and they'll say they believe it. You can ask them no matter who they are, what they're doing, and they'll say they believe it, and they do. Even though they're racist part of the time, or proto-nationalist part of the time, or out of their minds of patriotism part of the time, but they believe it. It's a social myth. My father believed it too. But he really believed it. All the time. After World War I, when he was mustered out of the Navy in Newport News, Virginia, he rented a horse and rode it all through Virginia and West Virginia. And he saw the kind of poverty and the ignorance which filled the backlands of America, and it was appalling. He rode through there in a mere sailor's uniform, but they thought he was an admiral. That's the level of the education of part of the country. So you have to look at that whole background when renunciation and evacuation take place, and nobody knew what was going on in Tule Lake. And when he went there, and this group of people met with him, and he was advised by the administration, actually, of Tule Lake, that they're, when he go on to see that the stockade had been torn down, they said, well, there are some people here who need to see you. And they were renunciants. And they were scheduled for deportation, and he had never heard of that. And they had sent letters out all over the place, and they couldn't find an attorney. Only the Northern California ACLU had even shown up to look at the stockade. That was the mentality at the time, because a lot of people who joined the New Deal with the best intentions had the illusion that they were speaking to power, that they were influencing power, and they could not break with policies of the New Deal. That's the problem. And so you had employees of the Department of Justice who knew better. You had political figures who knew better. You had administrative positions in the cabinet who knew better, who knew that there wasn't disloyalty, who knew that they couldn't justify the program, and who were in favor of leave clearance and in favor of closing the camp, didn't know how to do so. And Roosevelt didn't want to do so because he wanted to be reelected in 1944. So they delayed the Supreme Court hearing under excuse after excuse until he was reelected. And you have to understand, this is the way that motivations in politics works, but with the greatest harm and injury to ordinary members of the public, which all of us are. And that's why I guess that we have to watch and question, the values, statements, and histories that we are told and we are given. But to return to my father, I guess that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I was going to ask you also, well, let me ask Sharon one question first with regard to, I think the other star of the film was the tape. And what's the story behind that?
The tape?
The audio tape.
The audio tape.
The audio tape, the one that terrified,
the
thing that terrified Wayne the most. So I was very fortunate early on. I had read what is probably the most comprehensive book about Tule Lake that was written back in the 70s, after Michi Wegland's Years of Infamy, which is another incredible book about Tule Lake. But Donald Collins, who we interviewed in the film, who's 88 years old now and living in North Carolina, was incredibly supportive of this project. He was such an admirer of Wayne Collins that he insisted on giving me all of his research, including hours of audio tapes that I remember I actually gave them to Wayne, and I don't know how gladly he welcomed it, but and they were very garbled. I have to tell you that they were not in very good shape. So that's where we credit filmmaking, because we had a great sound editor, we had a great editor, and we were able to, cull the best parts of that audio tape. And I think you saw a little bit of it. I don't know if it's going to be shown on public television. I'm not quite sure, but. Anyway, thanks to Donald Collins. I wish he could be here today, but he doesn't travel anymore for good reason. And he has been kind of the person who has supported this project more than anyone, so.
And no relation, right, to...
Isn't that amazing? How coincidental is that? Native American Aliens is the book that he wrote. He wrote it just out of college, but it stands today as probably one of the most comprehensive. Would you say that, Brian? Because Brian's the historian.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, 1985. It was his PhD dissertation. I guess, Joy, were you gonna post the number? Oh, it's already up. Okay. Beat me to it. Okay, great. So yeah, we'll start taking your questions also in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah,
I actually have a question for Wayne because, again, the reason that I did this film was I heard him speak at the Tule Lake pilgrimage, and I remember the complicated process that your father had to go through in terms of the Otto Clark case and all the obstructions that he had. We tried to explain it in the film. I hope you guys got it because it had to do with a similar case that was filed by the Southern California ACLU. I'm wondering if, was that explained sufficiently? Is that something that you could...
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. The Murakami case was filed by Abraham Lincoln Weirin, who was an attorney who was affiliated with, but independent as well, of the Southern California ACLU. The Southern California ACLU was in orbit around the national ACLU, and the New Deal components had the belief that they were important people acting on power. And the Murakami case was cherry-picked as a case that couldn't be lost. The plaintiffs in the Murakami case were either underage when they renounced, so it was automatically void, or had serious mental diseases. That is, were certifiably not able to comprehend the meaning of an oath or comprehend the meaning of their acts. So they're lawfully precluded from waiving their citizenship. That was a rollover. And when that went up on appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal decided to hold on to that, say, oh, of course, these laws, this naturalization law, as applied to them, well, that's not constitutional. These people didn't know they were renouncing, they didn't comprehend the consequences of their acts. But as for Agbo versus Clark, the government has said that they can designate a certain number of people against whom they believe that they have valid reasons. And they named everybody in the lawsuit, 4,000 plus people. And Goodman had struck their motion to amend their complaint, and it went up on appeal on that basis. That was a lawsuit that put at odds Murakami versus Agbo versus Clark. It gave the government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the court a peg to hang their jacket on to say, well, we're going to send this back. We're not going to accept Agbo versus Clark as definitively overruling these renunciations or cancellations of nationality. And that led to a schism between the national ACLU and Northern California, which remained independent for 20 years thereafter, having no actual affiliation to the New York ACLU. That was the problem. And it was unfortunate. It caused a lot of anger between two offices, Northern California ACLU and the rest of the world. That clarified?
Very good.
Yeah, I wanted to ask George also if you ever felt any reluctance or hesitancy to talk about your family's Tule Lake story, because of the kind of the stereotypes about Tule Lake.
Well, I didn't learn about it until much until I was an adult. I was a child then. And in fact, I didn't even know that my father was beaten up by the Hoshidan until this year. There are researchers, archivists who were doing studies on the internment, or particularly Tule Lake. And she came across this piece of document that said, my father was a block manager, and the Hoshidan tried to take over a shipment of vegetables to the mess hall. And he tried to stop that, but it was one man against a gang, and he got beaten up so severely that he had to be taken to the hospital. And I never knew about it. My parents didn't tell me about it. No one told me about it until I got this report. And similarly, I found out I heard the name Wayne Collins when I was a teenager, and so I, as an adult, did my own research, and I came to know the story, and I asked my mother, and she told me about that story, but I learned about it as an adult.
Wow. Just to add, there's the pressure and tension in Tule Lake that was a consequence to their internment to begin with. About 18,000 people, was it? In a camp intended to hold 10,000. Yeah. In the worst, hottest months of the summer, when you would wake up in the morning with bugles blowing and Hoshidan members marching and encouraging people to shave their heads, they would bow to the rising sun, they would worship the emperor, and that was not something that the U.S. authorities impeded. They didn't stop it. So inmates of the camp weren't protected against the Hoshidan either. Now bear in mind that the Hoshidan themselves are victims of being interned in this camp, and that their renunciations, should they renounce, were also void for the same reason. But the fact that the government allowed this to take place knowingly is a great indictment of the entire program. And some people cracked up. Some people were badly beaten. But that's all a consequence of Executive Order 9066. And that's where the guilt rests, and that's the story.
I remember on the pilgrimage to Tule Lake, we visited the stockade, and that too I didn't know about until I was an adult, and my father told me, but I saw brown splotches on the concrete wall, and I asked one of the, what do you call them, the people that take care of the place? They're not docents, they're park rangers, are they? Park rangers, and it was a woman, and she told me that those brown splotches are the blood from people whose heads were bashed against the concrete wall. It was really an enlightening, shocking discovery, and it's still there. If you go on a pilgrimage to Tule Lake and go to the stockade, you'll see brown stains on the concrete wall. They won't tell you about it unless you ask. And I found that another evidence of the horrors that a democratic government can subject innocent people to. I mean, we had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. We were innocent, and we were rounded up, forced out of our homes from the very beginning, and then relentlessly, one after the other, the loyalty questionnaire, then the segregation, and then the violence at Tule Lake. It was the most militarized of all the camps. It had, as we saw in the film, tanks patrolling the perimeter, 3 layers of barbed wire fences when the other camps had just 1 layer, and the guard towers had machine guns installed there, pointed at us. I mean, a government gone awry and mad, literally madness, to inflict a series of outrages on innocent human beings. And you know, Sharon, watching this movie, I am so grateful that you took on this chunk of little-known history, and you're raising it so that we are having a conversation about it.
That means a lot, George. Thank you.
We have time for, we have a few questions, so we have time to take a couple of them from the audience. So starting with a question from Mas Moria, two-parter. Will audio tapes be made available for research to the public in the future? And I assume he's talking about the Donald Collins tape. And he asks also, what other parts of the story were left out of the documentary?
How much time do we have? Well, that's a question for Donald Collins as far as making it accessible. I know he's pretty generous. He was very generous with us. He was very generous with people like Wayne. I know Wayne got a copy of all of them, but I will definitely ask him and see if that's a possibility, because they are very revealing. And what was the second question? Oh, what we left? Oh God, I think that's. Where's Evan? Evan, are you here? I want him to answer that question. We left so much out. It's very, very sad. But one of the things that I insisted when we first started talking about this film was to make it a half hour. So Evan, up to you.
Well,
just one other anecdote about the Donald Collins tape. In his his dissertation, he had all the people he interviewed sign it. So like Tom Clark, the Attorney General, and Ernst Bessick, and Wayne Collins, of course. And when Wayne signed it, he signed his name in the middle of the page, and then he drew a giant X over the rest of the page so that Tom Clark or A.L. Weirin's name wouldn't appear on the same page as his. But in terms of other stuff we left out, I mean, there's lots more biographical stuff about Wayne. He had like a deep appreciation of Japanese art. I think he was friends with an art dealer, Senri Now, whose daughter actually later became one of his most trusted secretaries. And actually, the image at the end with the Wayne Collins quote is the Mirikitani, Jimmy Mirikitani painting, right? That was given to him because he was also at Tule Lake, right? Yeah.
The Mirikitani painting, and Mirikitani was a great painter in my opinion. Who was interned at Tule Lake and ended up, I think, at Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. Well, the wind is supposed to be my father, and he's blowing the sand to bury Tule Lake. The Castle Rock is in the background. But there were all kinds of people were at Tule Lake. People with artistic abilities, people with literary abilities. You read the letters of the internees, these young Americans who had a new language, not their parents' language, English. It was a new language to control with. The language flows, their articulation's incredible, and they believed in the American creed.
This might be a good time to introduce some of the people in the audience who are actually in the film, or descendants of people who are in the film. Kyoko, are you here? Kyoko Oda? Kyoko has done this incredible book which is your father's Takei diary. It's available in the JANM bookstore. It's very interesting. I'm so glad that you put all that work into publishing it. And then I'd also like to introduce the Tex Nakamura family who are with us today. Irene, Richard, and Mike. Tex, I don't think Tex doesn't get enough attention when we start talking about Wayne Collins, but Wayne here would definitely give due to him, who, he was the man who really helped Wayne Collins within Tule Lake. He worked with the Tule Lake Defense Committee, and they're the ones who actually hired your father. But after the war.
I think that's your next film project, isn't it?
Well, there's a hat under my chair, and I started wearing a hat because I loved Tex Nakamura and the hats he wore. Tex, when I was very young, there's this guy, Tex, he's the guy in the hat, and he was a legend for me. He said, this is an adult, they have hats. But Tex was the legal affairs officer in Tule Lake. And the largest document submitted by the plaintiffs in Tule Lake is a lengthy narration of all that happened there by Tex Nakamura. Which I think my father wrote much of it, but the informant is Tex. And it's a remarkable document. It explains everything. And there you have it.
One more person, and I want him to be acknowledged, is Francis Criado, who, with Visual Communications, they put on that great film festival every year. Are you still here, Francis? If it weren't for Visual Communications, with our fiscal sponsor, we would not have been able to get the money to make this film. So thanks, Francis. I think that's it. Art Hansen, is Art still here? I wanted to just mention Art Hansen because I don't know how many, I know a lot of you know him. He's a pioneer in oral history. And we're doing a program about him next week in this very spot. So I hope some of you are able to make it for that. He has been sort of another guardian angel over this project, because anytime I had questions, because he's actually interviewed a lot of the people that are featured. A lot of the people who were at Tule Lake at the time doing the JARS study, Art had talked to a lot of them. So he gave me some really valuable background information. I'm sorry he's not here. But anyway, next week, I hope some of you can make it to talk a little bit about the work he's done.
So, yeah, we're about at the end of our time, and then there'll be a little reception outside. But one final question or request from Harriet. My question is, how many people in the audience were interned or related to an internee at Tule Lake? I'm just curious about that. Wow. I should raise my hand also.
I know there's a few folks who also said that they were directly, their families were represented by Wayne Collins. Are any of those folks in here? Yeah. Wow. Thank you for being here today.
So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for our panel. And I'll turn it over to Joy for final instructions.
Yeah, I know that there was many questions and comments and thoughts that we couldn't get to today, but we're so grateful to all of our panelists. Can I have another round of applause?